APES. This video I will go through the practice exam free response question. On this one it will be covering question number 1. And so question number 1 gives you a diagram, and in the diagram it is the carbon cycle. And so the first question, question A, asks you to identify a process. So we're just going to be looking for a process, and because it's identify, you really can just name the process. Identify a process shown in the diagram that removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And so you go to the diagram, you find the word atmosphere, and you're looking for an arrow that comes out of the atmosphere, and you're going to see that we have photosynthesis, and then we also have absorption into the ocean. And so question number 1, you could answer it as photosynthesis, or you could have said absorption of carbon dioxide into the ocean. You don't want to just say ocean, even though that's where it is sinking, that's where it's going, because it's asking you to identify a process. So absorption would be the process, absorption of carbon dioxide into the ocean. Question 2 is also identifying a process shown in the diagram that sequesters carbon. So here they're really just saying, do you realize that removing carbon or sequestering carbon is the same thing? And so we're going to sequester carbon, we're going to remove carbon from the atmosphere for a geological period of time. And so geological here is going to be key, because what you want to look at is somewhere in the geosphere. And so if you're going to look in the geosphere, you know that we're moving carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And so we're going to be looking for this over time period. So over time, the formation of coal. Over time, we have the formation of oil and gas, or you could just say the formation of fossil fuels. In addition, you have over time the sediment in the ocean forms limestone. And so again, it's a process, so you want to talk about the formation, absorption, formation. Those are processes of whatever it is that you're saying it's doing. If we go to the next question, go to the next page. Question 3 is right up here. Based on the diagram, explain how the combustion of fossil fuel has led to an imbalance in carbon dioxide, or in the carbon cycle. This really kind of comes back to your understanding, or showing your understanding of the idea of a modern carbon, which really doesn't disrupt the formation or the carbon cycle, as opposed to combusting fossil fuels, which have taken a long time to form. And so a good answer, an answer that would hit this, would be just identifying that the combustion of fossil fuel releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at a faster rate than can be removed, therefore leading to an imbalance in the carbon cycle. And so that identification that you're releasing carbon dioxide at a faster rate than what you can be taking it back out, that's going to indicate that you're disrupting or creating an imbalance in the carbon cycle. Question 4 is an explain, so you have to be a little bit more detailed in your explanation. Explain the role of decomposition in the carbon cycle. So you just have to talk about decomposers and what do they do in the carbon cycle. Decomposers convert organic matter. So organic matter might have some synonyms here. You could say organic matter. You could literally talk about it as glucose. You could talk about it as biomass, dead organisms. That's all talking about the same thing. And so decomposers convert biomass of dead organisms, organic matter, C6H12O6, into carbon dioxide during the process of aerobic respiration, or into methane, CH4, during the process of anaerobic respiration. You don't have to say both of them. You could say either or, and it would give you the credit for that. When we go on to B, the first question, part B, is really that question targeting, do you understand the process of experimentation? And do you understand the components of the scientific method, how we work through science? And so it gives you a scenario. Scientists are interested in researching how carbon dioxide in the ocean is affecting pH. And so that's our independent and dependent variable. We're going to look at carbon dioxide and manipulate it to see how it affects pH is what we'll be measuring. They designed a laboratory experiment which they inject different concentrations of carbon dioxide. So that's what they're doing, right? They're injecting. And so this would be our independent variable into saltwater tanks containing calcium carbonate shells. Excuse me. The tanks were kept at the same constant temperature, so that's important. After several days, the scientists measured the pH. So what they're measuring is the dependent variable of saltwater tanks and observed its effect on the calcium carbonate shells. Identify the independent variable. It's identify, so you literally just say, go back, it's the concentration of carbon dioxide. Number 2, describe the control group. Well, if we want to know how the concentration of carbon dioxide affects the pH, a control group could be a tank kept at the same temperature, because we have to keep all of those other variables constant, with no carbon dioxide injected into it. And so we can compare that back. We can inject different levels, compare it back to when we don't put any in, and watch how it affects the pH. The third part, explain the effect of carbon dioxide on the pH of the ocean. Increased carbon dioxide dissolves in the ocean. This comes from our Pivot Lab. This leads to the formation of carbonic acid, decreasing the pH, which increases acidification. You don't have to get hung up in all the specific and intermediates. However, you do have to show a flow of increased carbon dioxide gets dissolved in the oxygen. That's going to go through a chemical reaction. It's going to form carbonic acid. That's acidic. That means it will decrease the pH or increase the acidification of the ocean. When we go on to number 4, it says describe the effect of water temperature on the amount of dissolved gases. This actually is going back, you don't get this from the reading, this is going back to some knowledge. And so the warmer the water temperature, the more energy it's going to have, the less likely that gases will dissolve, will stay within that water. And so the relationship is actually inverse. So you could say as water temperature increases, the amount of dissolved oxygen decreases. Or you could also say as water temperature decreases, the amount of dissolved oxygen increases. Now this question kind of set them up to really see, do you understand what's going to happen, so you can answer number 5. And number 5 says describe how the results of the experiment would change if the temperature in the tank was decreased. So you know we kept the temperature at a constant rate, and that was important to keep it at a constant rate because we don't want to change two variables. Here they're asking you, do you understand why? And so an appropriate answer to that would be going from understanding that inverse relationship with temperature and dissolved gases. As the temperature decreases, more carbon dioxide would dissolve, increasing the production of carbonic acid, which would lead to an increase in acidification, or would lead to a decrease in pH, resulting in a larger observed change in pH. Because if you go back to the question, it's asking how the results of the experiment, and our results were that change in pH. So how's the change in pH going to be different if the temperature was decreased? Well, if the temperature was decreased, then you're going to get more dissolved gas, in this case carbon dioxide, which would result in more carbonic acid, which would decrease the pH of the water, increase in acidity, and you would see a larger change in pH. And the last question here is describe how a decrease in ocean pH can affect marine organisms. This is a very similar question to the question that I asked on the Pivot Lab, although a number of you did not get full credit on that Pivot Lab because it was a little bit different than this. This question is actually a little bit more vague. The question on the Pivot Lab specifically was asking about calcium carbonate. And so on this question, because it's not asking specifically about calcium carbonate, right? It's implying that that's where you're going to go because the questions before were talking about that. However, describe how a decrease in ocean pH can affect marine organisms. That question isn't including specifics, and so you have an opportunity here to be a little bit more vague. But I would still try to bring in some specific examples if you can. All right? If you don't know 100%, then do not bring them in. So what a few answers could be, you don't have to have all of these. You could have one of the 3 bullet points I gave or a variety of something else. So I would start with a decrease in ocean pH causes the calcium carbonate shells of marine organisms to become thin and weak. You could just say that. You could say a decrease in ocean pH will make it harder for organisms such as mollusks to form shells. Or a decrease in pH will make it harder for organisms such as coral to form exoskeleton. Any organism that you know forms a shell out of calcium carbonate, you could talk about it. Or finally, you could be as general as saying a decrease in ocean pH. A decrease in ocean pH can negatively affect the ability of marine organisms to maintain homeostasis. Now that's pretty vague, but you're using a key word there, and that's homeostasis, so they would like it. That's it for the first question of the free response. I'll post videos for the second and third questions. If you have any following up questions that you want to ask, please send me a message and I would be happy to discuss those with you.